Okay, so welcome everybody. Please continue to engage in the chat box. If questions come up, you can put them in the chat box and we will read those to Nick as time allows. And with that, I am going to let Nick with the Boone County Schools Mental Health Coalition take over from here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Anne. First, thank you all for coming today. I absolutely love talking about student behavior. It's one of my favorite topics. I think it's super interesting. I think it's super vital, both to the mental health and just the overall success of students. So I appreciate y'all being here and hearing me out. What I'm really going to go over today is two different things. So I want to talk about general classroom management in classrooms or after school programs. So when you have a group of students that you're working with, what are some things that you can do off the bat to create an environment where those kids can be successful in the classroom? And what can you do to create an environment where you're seeing the behaviors you want to see in a classroom and you're not seeing the behaviors you don't want to see? So a big chunk at the start of this presentation is just going to be going through general behavior practices and what we can do in the classroom. Then towards the end of the presentation, I'm going to duck a little bit into when you do have a student that you're working with that has behavior that's disruptive or that's interrupting the classroom environment, or that's hurting other kids, or that's hard to manage. How can you create a successful plan for that child? A lot of my background, so I'm a school psychologist by training. I have my MED and my Ed.S in school psychology, and I'm a licensed school psychologist in the state of Missouri. So a lot of my training is in behavior, but a lot of my job also revolves around behavior. I'm a regional coordinator for the Boone County Schools Mental Health Coalition, which is a mouthful, but basically what that means is I go around to schools in Columbia, Missouri, and I consult with administrators and teachers on child behavior. So a lot of my job day to day is going to teachers' classrooms, going to administrators, going to whole buildings, looking at issues they're having with kiddo behavior, whether it's at the classroom level, the building level, the individual level, and I just consult on what we can do to help those kids. So I'm going to try to give you all as much information as I can today that I think will be really helpful for you. As Anne said, if you have questions while I'm talking, feel free to put those in the chat box and I'll pause at different points for questions. And if I say things that you're like, well, that sounds helpful, but I don't know how it'll help me in my situation, or I can think of a specific kiddo where that doesn't apply, feel free to bring that up because I'd love to kind of push back and forth and talk a little bit more what to do in those situations so I can actually help you out with the kids that you have. That being said, I'll get started. Can everybody see this slides on my screen, the managing disruptive behavior that's up? Is that looking all right? Awesome. Okay, so first and foremost, I just want to talk about some myths about behavior at first. I think it's good to clear the air a little bit, and there might be some tips that you've heard from colleagues or things that you should be doing. And I just want to touch base on some things that really don't work in classrooms. One of the biggest ones is letting the kids know who the boss is and letting them know that you're the boss and they need to listen to you. Kids, and you may have noticed this, if they don't have respect for you, if you haven't created an environment that's effective for them, it's really hard to get a kiddo to do what you want just by letting them know that you're in charge. A lot of the kids that we work with in schools, a lot of the kids that we work with in after school programs maybe don't have the best past or experience with listening to adult or authority figures. Maybe there's trauma in their lives that's made it difficult to do that. So one of the biggest things that we can consider is what are things that we can do to support their behavior without just asserting that we're the boss and they need to listen to us, because a lot of times that doesn't work. Another big myth is that kids should just know right and wrong from behavior. Sometimes I have teachers come to me because they have kids in their classroom and they're just like, man, this kid should just know better. Like, I don't want to create a plan for them. I don't want to do this. How do I just get them to act better because they should know better? The reality of the situation is today's education environment and today's after school program environment, kids are coming from so many different backgrounds. And a lot of times some kids have different rules at home and kids have different definitions of what's right and what's wrong at home. So this idea that every kid who comes into the classroom should be prepared to learn, should be ready, especially right now when we're dealing with the after effects of COVID, just isn't the case and can really set us up for failure when it comes to behavior. And the last one is that kids who misbehave are bad. This is one of the biggest misconceptions about behavior, because a lot of times the behavior kids are engaging in, it serves a purpose, and it serves a function. And they're engaging in that behavior because they've been reinforced and taught in their lives that can get them something that they want, whether that's adult attention, whether that's teacher attention, whether that's an escape from a task, right? So it doesn't mean that that kid's a bad kid. All it means is that kid has learned a behavior that's not really appropriate for the setting they're going to be in with you. And we'll talk more about that moving forward. Some truths about behavior. One of the things I just touched on is students use behavior to meet their needs. A lot of what kids' behaviors are and a lot of good ways to look at behavior involve thinking, okay, why is the student doing this? What are they getting out of this? Does this help them get the attention they need as a developing child? Does this help them get a break from a stressful task that they're enduring that they don't want to endure? One of the biggest truths about behavior that if we think about in the right way can help us a lot is knowing that a behavior is a means to an end. It's serving a function for a student. Another big one is misbehavior is normal. Students grow up in all sorts of environments, and we did as kids too. And a lot of times along the way, we pick up behaviors that aren't necessarily beneficial for the environment that we're in and aren't what we would call pro-social or good for everyone around us. And that's totally fine. Like, not all kids have to have perfect behavior, and kids misbehaving in your room, in your group, is totally normal and doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing anything wrong. It just means that the job that we take in after school programs is difficult, and there's a lot going on there. And the last one, and this is the biggest one, and we'll talk about this so much today, is behavior can be learned and can be taught. I could talk for hours about situations I've been in where kids who are bullying all day, every day, learn new behaviors like complimenting peers and interacting with peers in a positive way, and they forget that old behavior of bullying because they've learned a new skill that they can use. And that can apply across so many different situations in so many different environments. But if you have a kid who's misbehaving, I just want you all to remember, as working in after school programs, you have a lot of power in that kid's life. Like, behavior is teachable, it's learnable, and there's things that you can do that will teach that student behaviors that not just help them in your group and in your room, but help them for the rest of their lives and in education settings elsewhere. So I think a big thing to remember as we're going through this is behavior can be learned, behavior can be taught, and it's something that all of you can do well in your rooms if you put effort into it and try to learn more about it. Now, it's tricky, and the stuff that we want to do doesn't always work out, but I think it's important to know that you have a lot of power and a lot of capacity to help kids with behavior. So the big question I want to ask before I get into stuff, because what you say will really help me kind of frame different things I talk about in this presentation, is when you worked in after school programs, what are some typical problem behaviors you see in kiddos? Like, when you're working with kids, what are some things you can think of off the top of your head? Like, oh, I see this behavior a lot, or I see that behavior a lot, or this is really disrupting to the group that I have. So if anyone wants to speak out now or throw it in chat, I can read those out loud. Disrespectful and rude. That's a big one. I see that in my schools all the time. We want the kids to respond a certain way when we're giving them redirects and we're giving them instruction. A lot of times the way that they talk to adults is very disrespectful and is very rude. So I for sure see that, and I can kind of rope that into presentations. I'm giving examples. Challenging authority, man, that's massive. Not wanting to listen to adults, wanting to be in control, wanting to have power over the situations in the classroom. That is a massive one. And shouting over adults when they don't want to hear what the adult's saying. And I can definitely rope into my presentation some things about that as well. I'll give it another second to see if anything else pops up before I keep moving. Kids not paying attention, huge. Kids being destructive. I had a kid tear up a classroom today, throwing chairs everywhere, 100%. Copying others' behaviors, not following the rules that they know, awesome. So I'll touch on a lot of these things today. And I think that these are all really applicable to the things that we'll talk about in this presentation. And I will try to remember these as I'm going and wrote different things I'm talking about back into those. So thank you all so much for sharing those. I really do appreciate it. So if I can get this to bump. Okay, awesome. So first thing I want to talk about is one of the things that we were talking about there was disruptive behavior. So in the comments, I saw a couple things. I saw shouting over adults. I saw being destructive in the classroom. I saw just generally being off task. So that is something that I would consider disruptive behavior, and disruptive just meaning it's disrupting the classroom environment. It's distracting other kiddos. It's making it hard for you to use the content or what you're teaching and get it done. So I think some of the big impacts that we think about with disruptive behavior, and one of the biggest reasons it's so important to target, is because it impacts the other student's ability to maintain and sustain attention. Like, one of the comments that I just saw earlier was people will imitate behavior, and that's 100% true. But even beyond that, sometimes a student's behavior really affects the entire classroom. It's important to manage. It threatens the safeties of others and school. I know somebody mentioned being destructive. 100%. Like, I have seen kids get hurt in classrooms because there's a kid throwing a tantrum and trying to destroy objects. It's frustrating to the teacher and students. I'm sure I don't need to explain this one to you. It's really hard when you work a full day and you have a kid that's just not behaving at all. It causes a lot of burnout. It's very frustrating. There's a loss of instruction time. There's a loss of after school programming, and it overall impacts the environment you want to make in the classroom. So I think one thing that we maybe don't think about as much is one of the reasons it's so important to maintain really strong behavior principles in the classroom and to help kids is because that behavior doesn't just impact the classroom, it impacts that kid a lot. A lot of times kids who have disruptive behaviors are rejected from their peers. A lot of times they're not paying attention to their task, and why that might not affect them as much in kindergarten and first grade, it starts to catch up to them in later elementary and middle school and can really affect their academic outcomes. And a lot of times we see a trajectory where kids who have behavior problems at a young age follow in those footsteps and eventually don't graduate from high school, which has massive life outcomes on students. It can in fact affect their relationship with future bosses. It can affect their relationship with friends. It can affect their relationship with family. And the biggest thing from my perspective as a psychologist is, I don't know if we all realize this, but especially from a young age, behavior leads and dictates a lot of mental health concerns. Like behavior doesn't just come down to, is this kid going to succeed academically or not? It can lead to anxiety, it can lead to depression, it can lead to a variety of mental health conditions that really negatively impact the kid. So I think when we're thinking about behavior, a really good way to frame it is not just, how is this student's behavior frustrating for me in my class and why do I want to change it for that? But also, why do I want to change it for this student to really benefit them over time? So now we've kind of talked over those general aspects of behavior, what y'all are seeing in after school programming, just some highlights on how disruptive behavior can really affect students in the classroom and affect them in their lives. I want to touch on two really big tools that will help you from the get-go create a classroom or create an area in your after school program where kids are less likely to start that misbehavior and are less likely to start engaging in disruptive behavior. So this part of the presentation is really about, how do you create an environment where a majority of the students in that environment will behave in a way that is positive to the school, that is positive to the after school program, right? So one of the big things that you all can do is setting the tone. So this might seem small, but a good relationship with an adult in a building, it actually has major outcomes on whether or not that student is going to behave well or misbehave. So a big thing is, like, as soon as you start getting kids in your after school program, greet every single one of them at the door. I'm sure you all have seen the YouTube videos where people have special handshakes with each kid that comes into their room. If you want to do something like that, awesome. But just knowing the student's name, regardless of what they did or didn't do the day before, greeting them at the door, welcoming them to the classroom, and letting them know that you're happy they're there can have a really big impact on their behavior. Using eye contact and really starting each day fresh. I know a lot of times when we're working with kids, it can be easy to let what happened the previous day or the previous week get in the way of this, but doing everything you can just to be fresh for each one of those kids each day and give them a new start and be excited for them can really, really help. And this little thing in bold at the bottom, positive engagement and greetings alone can reduce misbehavior. One of the reasons this is a lot of times the reasons kids misbehave has to do with obtaining adult attention. They're being disruptive, they're being off task, they're arguing, they're being challenging to the teacher, they're not following directions, because that gives the adult in the room more of an incentive to keep a conversation going with that child. Even if it's not positive attention, it's a form of attention. But if we're greeting kids at the door each morning and filling them up with adult attention, it's less likely they're going to need to engage in those behaviors to get attention throughout the program that we're doing. So if you can really fill those kids up and give them a lot of attention off the bat, for those kids that are engaging in disruptive behavior to obtain adult attention, you're actually doing a lot just in that step to prevent that behavior from starting in the first place. So next one, and this is huge, this is where I start with a lot of teachers, are having expectations in your classroom, right? So expectations, like it says here, are clear guidelines that indicate the behavior you want to see in your classroom. I think the biggest thing about expectations that we need to know as professionals is they should be positively stated. And what that means is, for example, let's say one of the expectations in your classroom is you don't want kids to use curse words. Like, I have classrooms all the time where like third graders are just screaming the F word, and the teacher's like, hey, I don't want my third graders screaming the F word. Completely appropriate. A good expectation for that, rather than don't use cuss words, should be use appropriate language. We want to give the student something positive to do, not something negative to not do, right? So one of the biggest things when you're creating expectations is they should be very positively stated. If you're thinking in your classroom, what are things that I don't want these kids to do? Write those things down and then write them in the opposite. I don't want my kids to cuss. I want them to use appropriate language. I don't want my kids to fight. I want them to interact in a positive way. I don't want my kids to destroy objects in the room. I want them to respect classroom materials. Always think about that positive stating. That's a really big one, and it'll make more sense later on why I'm saying that. But that's really massive when creating expectations that are going to be helpful for kids. Posted clearly, when you come up with these expectations for your room, make sure you have a poster or something where they're written down so kids can reference them. And you also want them easily remembered. So a lot of times when I'm choosing expectations for the classroom, 3 that I like to use a lot are be respectful, be safe, and be kind. And those are all positively stated. They're telling the students what to be. And then on each one of those things, I'll give a couple of examples. So what does being respectful look like in the classroom? That means that when the teacher is talking, your eyes and ears are on the teacher. Being respectful means that we're using classroom objects appropriately. Being respectful means that when a peer is talking, we don't talk over them. Very clear examples of what the student can be doing. So when a peer is talking, see, I just said something negatively. It's easy to do. When a peer is talking, we want to be listening to that peer, right? Be kind. Instead of saying something like in the be kind realm, like we're not going to fight our peers, it's we invite our peers into games with us. So just coming up with 3 to 5 expectations, creating some examples of those things, posting them and reviewing them frequently can really give the kids that you're working with an idea of what they should be doing in the classroom. And even though we often think kids should just know this, a lot of them don't. So you're setting yourself up for success if you're creating a classroom where there's behavioral expectations for those kiddos. So this is a bad expectation. And the example, this is kind of what we just went through. Don't fight, don't play, don't steal, don't throw crayons. It's not telling those kids what to do. And the issue that happens there, and so there's don't throw crayons. Let's say there was a kiddo in the classroom that was throwing crayons to get peer attention. Like the function of that behavior was when I throw crayons at my peers, they think it's funny and they throw them back and I get them to laugh. If you just don't tell them not to do that, but you don't give them a way that they can get peer attention, they're just going to figure out something that's kind of crazy to get that peer attention. So it's really, really, really important when you come up with these expectations and these rules, you're telling them what to do. So this is a good example of it, right? So these are bus expectations. You could have these for a classroom and edit them a little bit. You could have them for an after school program. You could have them with a group for kids, but be respectful. That's a positive thing that's telling them to do, and it gives 2 explicit examples a kid can follow. Be responsible. Telling them what to do gives 2 explicit examples of what that means. So when you go into your program, when you go into your classroom, starting with this, making sure it's laid out well and going over it with the kiddos is going to have a really big impact for you. Before I move on, does anyone have questions about setting expectations for kids and things to do or not do there? And I'll look in the chat if anyone has anything and wants to post it, I can pause here and answer that. Okay, I'm not seeing anything, so I'm going to keep moving, but if something pops up, I'll address it.
No, but somebody just stated that they've done where they've worked with the kids and coming up with the expectations to get some buy-in.
Yeah.
And they come up with the main expectations and then the examples, but they have the kids help them come up with the expectations.
I think that's awesome. I think that's amazing. Having the kids buy in like that makes it a lot more likely they're going to follow the expectations. So whoever posted that, good job. I think it's awesome that you're taking the time to review those with your kids and to have them create them with you. That's a great strategy. Another big thing is avoiding unreasonable expectations. Kids are kids. Like sometimes they're going to be allowed in certain situations. Sometimes they're going to want to play, and there's going to be things that they want to do. So really, when you're making the expectations for whatever age range you're working with, after you write them, just take a step back and think, is this reasonable for these kids? Like, is this not just what I want? Is this reasonable for the kids that I have in the environment that I am in? Okay. So then one of the biggest things, and I will touch on this for individual student behavior too, is teaching. Teaching kids behavior is just like teaching them academic tasks. A lot of times we assume kids need to know things. In reality, we need to explicitly teach them what we want to see before they can do that. And there's a really easy way to do that. It's called teach, model, practice. If you remember nothing else from this presentation other than I can teach kids behavior, and I can do that with the teach, model, practice technique, that's fine with me. I mean, that will have a massive impact on kids as is. So what teach, model, practice basically is pick your expectations, and let's just take one, for example. Let's say the expectation that we're teaching right now is to be safe. And let's say that we've made an example of being safe, of we sit in our seats and we keep our hands and our feet to ourselves. That's what we consider being safe in the classroom. So the first thing that we want to do if we're teaching this expectation to a class is we want to tell them explicitly that. We want to say, hey kids, the first expectation we have is being safe. And being safe looks like having our hands and our feet to ourselves, sitting with our bottoms in our chair and our feet on the floor. That's what being a safe body looks like in our classroom. After you've explicitly stated that to a student, you want to model it for them. So what you want to do is pull up a chair in front of the classroom. That's one of your expectations. And you want to show them exactly what it looks like. So don't just tell them about it. Tell them about it. Show them how to do it. Almost like if you're doing a math problem. You would tell the student what the math problem is. You would do one for them probably, or work through one with them, and then you'd ask them to do it, right? So explain what you want them to do, show them how to do it, and then have them show you that they've learned it. So have them practice it. So say, okay, class, now I want everyone to show me what being safe looks like. If kids in the classroom in the group that you're with start doing it correctly, praise those students. Give them the feedback that it's talking about here. Say, hey, nice job, DeMarleon. You're doing a really good job. I love how your hands are on your table and your feet are on the floor. That's exactly what being safe looks like. And then if you see a student that's close but not doing it or is goofing off, praise some students around them and then look at that student and say, hey, you're really close, but what I need you to do is actually put your bottom in your chair. Okay, great job. Thank you for doing that. I love how your hands are on your desk. If we come up with the expectations, we describe them, we teach them, we model them, we practice them, we give the student feedback on what to do, we're explicitly showing them what they need to do in our classroom to be successful. And we're making it far less likely they're going to misbehave, because a lot of misbehavior is directed around a student not really being sure what they're supposed to be doing. So I would say creating these expectations and teaching them well should and will have a big impact in your rooms and with your groups. It's not going to ensure every kid is very well behaved, but it will ensure that the kids who listen to whole group redirects know what they're doing, and it'll enable it so the only kids in your classroom that are really misbehaving are the ones that are truly struggling. And that'll help you know where you really need to focus your efforts, rather than having a large group of kids who are misbehaving and not being sure which really need one-on-one time or more individual time from you. So just like I said before, reviewing. Review should happen regularly, especially when you have a new group of kids, and review should happen before misbehavior occurs. So you don't want to just be reviewing when you're seeing kids doing the wrong thing. Reviewing is a preventative approach, right? Like first week of school and classes, a lot of teachers will do this every single day. They'll do it in the morning when the kids come in, they'll do it at lunch. It's almost like a drill, right? They're just having them do it over and over again. So it's making it more likely that students aren't going to engage in the wrong behaviors. So reviewing those expectations that you have, especially because you've already put in the effort to create them, is going to be very helpful. So another big one is you create your expectations, right? So you have this list of things that kids should be doing in your classroom, but now you're actually doing the after school program. Kids are engaging in what you want to be engaging them in. Some kids are following the rules. Some kids aren't following the rules, and you need to respond to those students now. One of the biggest things that I can say is giving good redirects is going to save you a lot of trouble in the long run. So giving good redirects, meaning if a kid is like, I don't know, let's say we've taught them the sitting in the chair example, like hands on chair, feet on floor, bottom and seat. You see a kid and he's sitting on his desk, his hands and his feet are wiggling around everywhere, right? Don't say, hey, stop kicking like that. Don't say, hey, you shouldn't be doing that. Give the kid a redirect on what they should be doing based on the expectations you made. So be specific. Hey, I see that you're sitting on your desk right now. That's not being safe. Being safe in our chair looks like having our butt in the seat, our hands on the desk, and our feet on the floor. Can you show me that, please? Every command is positive. So everything I just said there wasn't telling the kid what not to do. It was telling them what to do. For the kid in my mind, that was developmentally appropriate. I was picturing like a second grader. They should know how to sit in their seats. It was an individual command. I gave one thing at a time. It was respectful and polite. I didn't assume the student was doing something wrong intentionally. I respected they may not know, or they may have gotten distracted. It was only essential commands to the expectations that were reviewed. They were carefully timed, and the tone of voice there is neutral. So giving commands in this way, and I'll send out these PowerPoints to everyone so you don't have to like memorize this right now, because we'll keep moving forward, can help a lot with student behavior in the classroom. So The things that you really want to do are give that redirect or that command, allow the student to comply. And once they've complied, if you want to reinforce them doing that in the future, praise it. So after you've given that redirect and the student returns to sitting, say, thank you so much. That's exactly what being safe looks like. I love how your hands are on your desk. That's fantastic. Having a sequence like that can help a lot with kids responding to the directions that you're giving them. Whereas a lot of times if we just say, stop doing that, or that's not safe, the kid actually gets frustrated and misbehaves more because they're not sure what they should be doing, or in that moment, they become a bit emotional about it and they're not thinking clearly. Whereas if we give them a really clear redirect, it can help ensure in the moment they go back to what we want to see them doing. So ineffective, I'm just going to glaze through this because we kind of talked about it, but will you stop yelling, stop it, turn around, stop talking, sit still, and listen to me. These things are emotional. They're not explicit, and they're going to make it more likely that kid actually escalates their behavior. So we talk about two main tools now to help these kids out. So we've talked about creating expectations for kids. We've talked about how to teach those expectations, and we've talked about how to give kids redirects. What I want to emphasize is that praise for students that are doing the right thing and following the expectations, 99% of the time is more powerful than a redirect to the student who's not following expectations. So when you create these expectations and there's kids in your group or your classroom who are following them, do everything you can to praise those students. So when you see kids sitting safely, if we're following that example, just praise it, even for the kids that are doing it all the time, right? So when you see a kid sitting safely, just shout that out in class. Hey, Joey, I really appreciate how you're sitting safely right now. That looks fantastic. I appreciate it. Caroline, you too. That's absolutely wonderful. Giving those praises to students who are doing it right is going to encourage other students to start doing it too, because they likely want that positive attention from you. Whereas if you give a redirect to a student who's not doing something right, why in the moment that might change what they're doing, it's not as powerful as a motivator as them seeing another student getting your positive attention and then readjusting to do that thing. So when you're seeing kids following the expectation, use that praise as much as you can. Praise statements are exactly like the expectations we talk about. Praise exactly what you see the student doing that you like. If that's the hands on the desk, if that's the butt in the chair, if you're praising a student for complimenting another student, make sure you're saying exactly what you're seeing them doing. So when other students hear that, in their heads, they're like, oh, this is what I can do to get that praise. Make sure it's positive, be as happy, upbeat about it as you can. And the quicker that you praise a behavior, the more effective that is, and not only encouraging that student to do that thing more, but also in helping other students realize what's going on. So praise statements, massive. They're a huge tool that we can use. One of the big things that we stand by is strive for 5 positive praise statements for every 1 correction. So every time that you redirect a kid on something, you should be asking yourself, before I gave that redirect, did I praise 5 students? Because we find that teachers who do 5 praises to 1 redirect have much lower rates of misbehavior in their classroom. So that's one thing to check on yourself is, am I praising students 5 times as often as I'm redirecting them? Because that's one thing that can help a lot right there. There's some examples of praise starters that you can use there, but you can brainstorm your own as well and get really creative with these. So that's one of the first big tools. So we came up with the create expectations, talked about teaching those, how to make them happen in the classroom. Then we gave you a tool, which is praise statements, massive. The second major tool is planned ignoring, which this is a big one. So I'm sure as working in after school programs, you see all sorts of kids' behaviors. There's tons of stuff going on. And if you wanted to handle all of that stuff, it would probably rob you of all of your time. One of the biggest tips I can give is figure out what things you can ignore in your classroom. What things aren't that big of a deal. Maybe it's you get really annoyed because there's one student just tapping on his desk. It has a pencil just tapping on it over and over and over. It drives me crazy sometimes, but it's probably not quite as big of a deal as a kid throwing a chair across the room or a kid yelling a curse word at another kid, right? So you want to think of stuff in your classroom that you can just ignore. And the reason I say that is a lot of times when kids engage in those behaviors, they're trying to get your attention. A lot of behaviors are directed around adult attention. So simply by ignoring them, you're actually making it less likely they happen, because the kid never learns, if I do that, I get the adult's attention. She comes over and gives me a redirect. A lot of times kids don't differentiate between positive and negative attention. So in those situations, just by ignoring it, you're actually creating an environment where a kid's not reinforced to keep doing that, right? It also helps kind of de-escalate and get you out of situations where you have power struggles. If you have students that do like to argue, that do like to get on you, Just picking things that you're actually going to deal with them and things that you're just going to ignore can save you a lot of time and help you not set a norm of having power struggles. And it also, like I said, it really communicates that behavior that they're doing is not even going to be addressed by you. It's not going to get your attention. It's not going to get you all upset. It's not going to get you worked up. It's just going to be something that you ignore. But the big thing with this, and this goes back to the first tool that we talked about, is if a student is doing something to get your attention and you ignore it, that's awesome. You haven't given them the thing that they want for doing the thing that you don't want to see. But if you don't teach them a new way to get your attention, they're just going to escalate that behavior and it's going to get a lot harder for you to manage. So if you make sure that you're using praise statements for the kids around them that are doing things well to get your attention, and you're praising that student when they do appropriate things to get your attention, you're making it easier for them to get your attention by doing the things that you want to see rather than by doing the things that are really disruptive to your class. So don't just planned ignore. Planned ignoring is actually really, really hurtful to a classroom if it isn't accompanied by praise, because you're going to get a situation where you have all these kids that don't know how to get your attention and they're going to start escalating, and that escalation is not fun to deal with. So takeaway ideas, one thing that I recommend teachers do is develop a nitpick plan. When you're starting to get pretty annoyed with some kids that you're working with, one day after school, just sit down and write down things I won't tolerate and things I will tolerate, and try to make those two sides of the table even. You don't want things I will not ignore, 10 items, things I will ignore, 1 item. Try to come up with a fair split and really ask yourself, in my classroom, what are the things that I really need to jump on? And what are the things that I can kind of let slide and continue to reinforce the students that are doing well with positive attention and praise, and let those things work themselves out. So this is an example of one of those, but I recommend doing this if you have days where you're just like, man, I just keep arguing with this one kiddo, or I just keep arguing with this group of kids, I just don't want to get in that anymore. This is a good starting point. So yeah, planned ignoring and praised. Combined, they're called differential attention. That's kind of what I just talked about, of how if you think a kid wants your attention, you're ignoring the thing that they're doing to get it, and you're teaching them a new way to get it, and then praising them for that, right? Where if a kid wants peer attention, we're differentiating how they can get that to make it more likely they engage in the behavior that we want to see. And what's really cool about this is if you do this well, that will extend to beyond your classroom when that kid goes to future classrooms, right? Like if you can teach a kid skills and things they can do in your classroom to get your attention, and you're doing a good job of planned ignoring and a good job of praise, then it's likely that when they move forward, they're going to have learned those skills. And because you're doing this with your whole class and you have these expectations and you've taught and you've practiced them and you're working on this, you can actually make the classroom teacher that has this kid the person who's going to have them in the after school program the next season, the next semester, the next year. You can make their lives way easier for massive groups of kids because you've created an environment where kids know what they need to do to be successful. Yeah, so I've kind of talked on all this. I'm going to bounce through it. So we're going to jump now into the responding to individual behavior, which is probably my favorite part. I think it's super interesting. But before we do that, of anything I just mentioned with planned ignoring, with praising, with differential attention, do you all have any questions or anything that I can answer for you right now before we keep moving?
So Nick, Ariana put in the chat box, it wasn't really a question, and you may have addressed it with the praise and the planned ignoring, but a lot of my kids know the expectations. They help create them, but they choose not to listen.
Yeah.
So you may be going there now, and you may have hit it with the praise and the planned ignoring, but.
Yeah, no, that's so great question, Ariana. Oh, this is another one. Would you suggest if you have service into it? Whoever just asked the question about moving the students you praise closer to them, not a bad idea. That's something we call proximity. It's also not a bad idea to move those students closer to you so it's more quick and more direct to your positive attention from them. So if you do have those several students who aren't following expectations at the same time, if you have other kids that you don't think will be distracted by them, it is not a bad idea to put those kids close. So when you're giving those praise statements, the other students are hearing it, for sure. Like, I think that's a good strategy. I think it's smart that you're thinking about it that way. Ariana, your question, a lot of my kids know the expectations, but they do not choose to listen to them. The first thing I would ask yourself is how many total kids are in the classroom and how many kids are choosing not to listen to them. If it's a large percentage of the students that are choosing not to listen to them, then I would say revisiting, how did we state these expectations? Are they positively stated? revisiting, was I sure and clear when I taught the kids these expectations that I use teach, model, practice are two really good places to start. Because if it's a large majority of your classroom doing it, there's probably still some ways to increase that effectiveness of the classroom expectations before moving into individual intervention. So I would say the first thing that you check is, are these positively stated? The second thing that you ask yourself is, did I teach these really well and make sure that the kids know them? And the third thing I would check is, are these things being really reinforced? Am I giving out 5 praise statements for everyone redirect? If you're saying yes to all those things, if you are giving the 5 praise statements out, if you did do teach, model, practice, if there's a small number of expectations that are clear and concise and very well defined, appropriate age level, you probably are a little bit unlucky and have a group that just has a lot of kids that aren't responding very well to that. And what we talk about next will help. But if you ask yourself those questions and you're like, you know what, I could possibly state these a little bit differently. Or you say, you know what, I did teach them, but I don't think I reviewed them a ton, and I don't think I taught them explicitly enough. Or, you know, like we made them, but I'm probably not praising 5 kids for everyone to redirect. I'm probably not giving 30 to 40 pieces of praise out per session after this. I would say in those situations, try doing those things first and see if that gets you anywhere. Time it takes the kiddos to grasp this. Yeah, average amount of time it takes the kiddos to grasp this, that really depends on the population of students that you're working with, to be honest. Different groups of kids in different areas are going to take different amounts of time to grasp this. So it really depends. And I would say when you say a lot of your staff do a really good job, but just struggle to sustain it and get discouraged, a lot of that sustaining it comes with consistently giving out those praise statements throughout the year, and really making sure that they're reviewing the expectations regularly and they're giving out that praise regularly. Because I feel like as the year goes on and in our after school programs or in our schools, as we get other responsibilities piled on us, it's hard to continue focusing on, am I giving the praise? Am I doing this the right way? Am I redirecting in a positive manner? So I would say it takes every kid a different amount of time, but if you want to see this sustained, especially if it's working in the beginning, really checking in on those teachers and encouraging them, or checking in on those workers and encouraging them, keep using those praise statements, keep reviewing these weekly, and like continuing to do that could be really helpful. I hope that's a helpful answer. A lot of these things are really situation specific, so I would love to like follow up and ask you a couple questions about what's going on there so I could provide better advice. But just within the context of the presentation, I unfortunately don't have time to do that. Thank you guys for the questions, though. I hope that was helpful. I hope I didn't rant too much there. I'm going to move into, though, responding to individual behavior, because I think this is really important, and I think it might help y'all a lot. And it's something that I teach a lot to teachers, and I'm pretty passionate about. But so I'm going to try to go through this quickly. I'm assuming this presentation ends at 2:30, Ann?
Well, we go to 2:45 actually, so
that's helpful for me.
Okay.
Okay, awesome. So responding to individual student behavior. So this comes into play, right? The way that we think about this as school psychologists is in any group of kids, if you create a really solid classroom environment, a majority of the kids in the classroom are going to respond well to that. Like typically what we see and what research has shown is if you do things like coming up with those expectations, if you have a 5-to-1 ratio of praise to reprimands, if you've taught everything well, the majority of the students in the classroom are going to respond to that, but not everybody is. Like in almost every group, there are going to be some kids that even with those expectations being taught, even with you using praise, even with you having them positively stated, are still going to struggle with some behaviors. Like that's totally normal, and we see that a lot. What I'm going to talk about next is really geared for those students. What I will say is if you have not taken the time to create an environment where students are already likely to succeed, if you're not doing greetings at the door, if you don't have classroom expectations laid out, if they're not positive, if you're not using praise statements, there's going to be so many kids struggling that it's going to be really hard for you to know who needs individual behavior help. And your time is going to be sucked from you so quickly if you try to make too many individual behavior plans. So I would encourage all of you really take a reflective look at what you're doing with your groups and what you can change on the environmental level. And then after that, look at this individual help for students, where you may get overwhelmed very, very quickly with it. Just my personal advice. But when responding to student behavior, these 5 steps are massive and can address almost any behavior. And they're at the core of what professionals and board certified behavior analysts use, as what people who specialize in working with students with autism use, what behavior specialists like myself in school districts use. I've kind of condensed a lot of our theories into 5 steps that you can use with any behavior. And this is a lot of the framework that professionals like myself use in schools on a daily basis, and that I think you all can actually use pretty well with just a basic understanding of it. So the 5 steps, when you have an individual student that's engaging in a behavior that is really, really hard to manage: define the behavior, determine a function, and I'll talk about what that word function means, define a replacement behavior, teach the replacement behavior, and then reinforce the replacement behavior, right? So this first step, come on slides, there we go. Define the behavior. So this is mega important. A lot of times kids who are engaging in disruptive behavior are engaging in more than one behavior at a time. You might have a student, like I'll make up a student name, let's say there's a kiddo named Kyle. And let's say Kyle's doing a lot of stuff in my classroom that's really distracting. Let's say that during carpet time, he's singing out loud when the teacher's talking. Like that's one of the things that he's doing, is just a huge pain in my butt. This Kyle will not stop singing when I'm trying to teach my lesson. And let's also say around lunch or recess time, he has a huge issue with punching and hitting kids. Like his way of playing is rough play and he's hurting kids, right? It would be an error to think that those 2 behaviors are the exact same thing. And when we're working with the student to help with behavior, we want to pick one behavior at a time and focus on that. And we want to explicitly define that thing. So the question that we need to ask ourselves when we have a student who's engaging in disruptive behavior is there more than one behavior going on here? And the best way to do that is just start writing down what they're doing. And when you have a list of different behaviors that they're engaging in, just ask yourself, which of these is the most annoying? Like which of these is the most disruptive? Which of these is the most unsafe? That is the behavior to start with. And on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about like how you can group some behaviors together in a behavior plan, because that is totally possible, but really coming up with a clear definition of like when Kyle punches his friends, when Kyle screams curse words at his friends, and when Kyle messes with his friend's stuff, that's the behavior I want to work on, because those are all focused on his friends and they're all disruptive towards his friends. When he's singing in the classroom, that's really annoying, but that's going to be the next thing that I address, because this disruptive behavior towards his friends is the hard part. So I would say, write out the behaviors, pick one, and then just start working on that one. As you go, celebrate progress with that behavior, and we'll talk about when that happens. But I would just say, I know it can be hard. And sometimes we have kids that have a lot and we're like, oh man, I want to fix all of these at the same time. It's going to be way more efficient for you to do one at a time than you to try to address 3 behaviors at the same time. So define that behavior. A lot of the words that I use to define behaviors are things like off-task disruptive, meaning they're not doing their work and they're disrupting their peers. Off-task aggressive, they're not doing their work and they're being aggressive towards peers and towards objects. On-task disruptive, while they're writing an assignment, they're singing out loud. But if you can take a behavior, you can write it down, you can define what a kid's doing or a group of related behaviors and really explicitly define that, it's going to help you make a plan for that kid. So step 1, define the behavior. Step 2, determine the function of the behavior. So function is a word that we use, which essentially means what is the purpose of this child's behavior. So if we go back to Kyle as an example, right? Let's say that the behaviors that we group together that we think are really related and are really part of one behavior are cursing at his friends, punching his friends, and messing with his friends' stuff. I would say that the function of those behaviors is peer attention, because when Kyle punches his friends, they yell at him, meaning the thing that happens right after he punches them is peer attention. It might be negative, but it's still attention. When Kyle curses at his friends, the first thing that happens is his friends yell back at him. Once again, negative attention, but attention. And when he messes with their stuff, the first thing that they do is they turn and pay attention to him. So I would hypothesize that the function or the purpose of this behavior I've defined, this off-task disruptive toward peer behavior, is peer attention, because I think that's what Kyle's getting out of the behavior. So the function is, what is the purpose of this behavior? A really easy way to identify that, let's say you have a kid that you're like, man, I don't know what the function of this behavior is. Try writing down the A, B's, and C's. A means antecedent, behavior is B, and consequence is C. Antecedent is just the thing that comes right before the behavior. So ask yourself the question, before Kyle punches his friends in the face, what happens? Maybe the thing that's always happening right before Kyle punches his friends in the face is the recess bell is ringing and they're going out to recess. Like they get out to the playground and he immediately punches his friend in the face. That might be the antecedent. Maybe right before Kyle punches his friend in the face, that friend is coming up to Kyle and saying a mean insult. Maybe the antecedent to Kyle punching a kid in the face is that. But just saying, this is the behavior, and next time you go with your group, looking and seeing what's happening right before that, that's the antecedent. You've defined your behavior, so you already have that. Watch what happens right after Kyle punches a kid in the face, right? Maybe right after Kyle punches a kid in the face, 3 other kids come over to Kyle and start yelling at him. That would be peer attention. Maybe right after Kyle punches a kid in the face, his counselor in the building or at the after school program comes and has an hour-long conversation with Kyle. I would say the function there is probably adult attention, because when Kyle's punching someone in the face, he's getting sustained adult attention, right? So when you have a student, after you've defined the behavior, ask yourself what comes before this behavior, what comes after this behavior, and why do I think the student's engaging in this behavior, right? That will give you the function. It will give you the purpose. If you already have a kiddo that you're like, I know why they're singing in class. They're singing in class because they want me to come over and ask them to stop. It's probably adult attention. You don't need to write down your ABCs. But whatever you need to do to determine that function, do it, because this is the pivotal part of a behavior plan for a kiddo. Big thing though, kiddos don't have functions, behaviors do. Like I mentioned earlier, Kyle might be punching kids, he might be singing on the carpet. Punching kids might be peer attention, singing on the carpet might be adult attention. That's one of the big reasons we focus on one behavior at a time, is because we don't want to assume that Kyle as a human being just needs more peer attention than everybody else. We want to think about, why is Kyle engaging in this behavior? What is the purpose of it for him? Because if we know that purpose, we can manipulate it. I would say majority of behaviors that you'll see in after school programs fall in these bottom 3 buckets of either peer attention, adult attention, or escape from task. Meaning they're either trying to get their peers' attention, they're either trying to get your attention, or they're either trying to not do their work and get out of it. A good example of escape from task is let's say that Kyle walks over to my desk and grabs my computer and throws it on the ground. And when he does that, he gets sent out of the room for an hour. No adults talk to him, but he just has to go sit outside and deal with his consequences. The function of that behavior is probably escape from task, because when he breaks my laptop, he's escaping from that task for an hour. So those are functions. Before I keep going, does anyone have questions about functions of behavior, about anything that I just said on finding them, or just anything in general? Anna, you see any comments pop up?
I'm looking and I don't see any right now.
Okay, I'll keep going then. So
Okay.
Step one, we define the behavior. Step 2, we identified its function. This is where things get crazy. So now what you want to do is define a replacement behavior. So if we have defined the behavior and we define the function, of essentially what we've done is we've figured out that our student does this to get this. And whenever they do this, they get this thing. So our after school program, my classroom, my environment is teaching this kiddo that in order to get this, they need to do this. The question you ask yourself then is, what do I want them to do instead to get this thing? That's what we call a replacement behavior. For example, so this is, I'm going to use fake names here, but this is a real example I had from my classroom last year. I had a kid who was much like Kyle, was punching other kids, was bullying other kids, was saying really mean insults to other kids. So we hypothesized that he was engaging in aggressive behavior towards his peers to obtain peer attention. So we asked ourselves, what would we rather have this kiddo do to get peer attention? And we figured we'd rather have him be kind. So the replacement behavior that we made for this kiddo was being kind to peers. And exactly like classroom expectations, we explicitly defined that for him. We sat down with the student and said, hey, we really want to see you being kind to your peers. And to us, this is what that looks like. Giving peers a compliment, which means saying something nice to them. It could be, I really like your shoes, or I think you did a really good job on that assignment. A way that we encouraged him to be kind to his peers, and how we define that was asking friends to join him in games and asking them to help him on assignments. And another way that we asked him to be kind to his peers was, let me think of this one really quick, because we had 3 things. We had giving compliments, we had asking nicely to do things, and we said just interacting with peers on assignments and in tasks where we're not raising our voice or saying mean words. So just a common conversation with those students using a good tone. So we really explained these 3 things to him, and we said, hey, this is being kind towards peers, and this is what we want to see you do in the classroom, right? And the way that we got there is we thought to ourselves, what would we rather have this kiddo do than punch kids and then yell at kids to get their attention? We'd rather have him be kind. We came up with be kind. It was an age-appropriate expectation for him, and we taught him what that looked like, which leads to our next step. Is after you've come up with replacement behavior, whatever that is, use teach model practice, which we talked about at the beginning of this, and show them what it is. So when we taught him what be kind looked like, We would literally say, this is an example of a compliment. I would act like I was a student. His teacher would act like she was a student. And she would say, hey, Nick, I really like your shoes. And I would say, oh, thank you so much. And then we'd say, hey, Kyle, how about you give this a shot? And Kyle would look at me and say, you're a jerk. And we'd say, no, good try. That's not what being kind looks like. Let's do this again. She would say, Nick, I really like your shirt. I'd say, thank you so much. I'd say, Kyle, you try. And he'd say, hey, Nick, I think you're a nice guy. And we'd say, yes, Kyle, exactly. We taught him what it looked like. We modeled the behavior for him. We had him practice it, and then we reinforced it. So after you come up with a replacement behavior, as dumb as it sounds, do that with the kid. And a lot of times replacement behaviors, like let's say you have a kid who's gallivanting around the classroom, knocking stuff over, a replacement behavior for that could be sitting safely in his assigned area. I mean, it can be as easy as, man, this kid is gallivanting around the room and knocking stuff off people's desks to get peer attention. How would we rather have the student get peer attention? I would rather have him sit in his desk and do his work and him get peer attention through that. And I'll explain how we can make that happen, but really coming up with that replacement behavior, explicitly teaching it to the student and saying, hey, this is what we're gonna do in the classroom now, right? And this is the cool part. So now we wanna reinforce it. So we've thought of the bad behavior and the things that it's getting. We've now taken the bad behavior, we've thrown it out the window, we've picked a new behavior that's age appropriate for the kid that we've taught explicitly, and now we're gonna show them this thing gets them this. So what we did with the fake student that I've created, Kyle, who's based off a real student, and we said, look, every time you give a kid a compliment, every single time that we see you interacting with peers on group work with a positive tone and appropriately, and every time we see you ask a peer to join you, we're gonna give you a little tally mark on this Post-it note. And when you get 5 tally marks, you get to pick a friend and you and that friend get to sit over on the carpet and have a 2-minute iPad break, right? So what we did there was we taught him that when, instead of doing this bad thing, instead do these good things. And when you do those good things, you're going to get this instead. We effectively taught the student a new behavior to replace the behavior he was using to get peer attention, right? We created a reinforcement system for it. We put tally marks on a piece of paper. You can put stickers on a chart. You can put pennies in a jar. You can put rubber bands on a wrist. You can draw stars on a whiteboard. It doesn't matter what it is, but essentially what you do is you just create a system where you're reinforcing that replacement behavior, and the reward the student is getting involves the thing that they're trying to get. So let's say it's a kid gallivanting across the room, knocking stuff off desks. A great reward would be like, hey, every time you're sitting in your desk safely, which you would explicitly define, for 5 minutes, we're gonna put a tally on a Post-it note. And when you get 5 tallies on your Post-it note, you can have a break with any peer you want and go sit on the carpet and have 2 minutes of iPad time. If the function of the behavior was adult attention, let's say he was gallivanting across the room, but it wasn't actually for peer attention, he's knocking stuff over because every time he does that, you come up to him, say, guess what, man? Every single time you do this 5 times, and we mark that and we check it down. Every time you're in your seat for 5 minutes, we're gonna give you a tally mark. When you get 5 tally marks, you can go take your tally mark sheet to the office and show the office secretaries. And then we tell the office secretaries, give him a ton of adult attention. And he's learning that by doing this new behavior, sitting in my seat, I'm actually gonna get even more adult attention than I would if I just gallivanted across the room. And there's a lot of different ways you can use that in your after school programs. You can use various rewards. Maybe you know there's another counselor or worker at the after school program that the kiddo really likes. And if that kiddo has a behavior surrounding adult attention, use that in adult as a reward system. Explicitly tell the kiddo what you want to do to get a break with that adult, show them how it works, teach them that skill, reinforce it like crazy, and then allow them to have that. And really what you do in those situations and why this is so powerful is we're no longer just ignoring a student. We're no longer just removing the thing that they're trying to get. We're actually teaching them a pro-social, successful way to get that thing. Through that, we can teach kids social skills. We can teach them behavior norms. We can teach them classroom rules in a way that's really motivating to them and carries with them through the rest of their life. Like that kid that we made the bullying plan for doesn't bully anymore. He's gone 2 grades since we've made that plan, and he's continued to have those skills of giving kids compliments and things like that. So that's actually the end of the presentation. I'll just end it with saying, I'm going to go back to this slide because I think this is huge, is define the behavior, determine a function, define a replacement behavior, teach it, and reinforcement. It might sound complicated at first, but if you just think to yourself, what is the student doing? What are they getting out of it? How do I switch this with something else and really reinforce it? You're off to a good start. You can also make up things in this of like, let's say the student was doing it for peer attention. you can come up with a system of whenever they do bully or whenever they do punch a peer, I'm immediately going to put that kid in the hallway. So they start to learn, not only do I get peer attention for doing the good thing, but it's actually impossible for me to get peer attention doing the bad thing. It's just, if you don't give that outlet and don't teach a new behavior, it's much more likely that kid's going to start engaging in worse behaviors to try to figure it out. What questions do you all have for me about define, determine, define, teach, and reinforce, or about any of this presentation? Because that's all I have, and I'd be more than happy to answer questions as they pertain to specific situations or just overall questions y'all might have.
Hey, Nick, I was wondering, we have a lot of students in our programs that on the spectrum.
Yeah.
So does this, what you shared today, can this translate to kids maybe on the autism spectrum that have like IEPs? Does it translate to them, or is that a whole different training that we?
No, it does.
Okay.
So all these principles translate totally to kids that have different disabilities. The thing to keep into consideration is that for a student with a disability, they might need much more explicit definitions. They might need like a visual schedule, right? So you might not be able to just show them and teach them a replacement behavior. You might need to come up with a picture chart that shows them how to do that they can reference in their classroom. It also, kids with different disabilities may need way higher levels of reinforcement to get that new behavior and learned. So I would say that these principles, like the principles of behaviorism, which is what I'm explaining to you all, is what is used by individuals who focus on students with autism and work with students who have autism. It's just there's an additional level of support and need at each one of those steps for a student with a disability. So the principles carry through. It's just going to be more time intensive and require more supports. We could do another presentation 100%, or I could find someone who can take this and talk about what that looks like for students with autism. But that's a whole nother conversation. But as long as you do know that these principles do track, and that's what a lot of professionals in that field use. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. There is a question that says, does it ever come to a point that he doesn't need this reward anymore, but is not getting upset when we aren't rewarding them because the new behavior is now second nature?
Yeah, so we actually scale these behavior plans back. That's actually the goal, and it does work. So let's say I have like we were talking about that situation with Kyle, and I'm giving him 5 tally marks, and he's getting a break with a friend. If he learns that behavior and does really well with it, the next week I'm like, Kyle, you're doing such a good job, buddy, that actually like we want to see how much you can progress. We're going to set a goal of you have to get 7 tally marks now to get that reward, right? And you start to scale the intervention with conversations with the kid, so they start to realize and they start to learn to be able to do that behavior without it. And typically kids do fine with that. Like I haven't run into a situation where I scale a behavior plan back and a kid's like freaking out because the rules aren't the same, as long as we're explaining that to them along the process. If a kid is getting upset, like one trick that I might use, let's say it was 5 tally marks, I might make it 7 tally marks, but I might say, hey, your iPad reward is going to be 3 minutes instead of 2 minutes. And then I might move to 10 tally marks and do the same thing. But when I move to 15 tally marks, I might start shortening that reward again. So you kind of have to play a little bit with it to figure out like how exactly can I scale this while keeping the student happy. But what's nice about it is, like, let's take the example of the Kyle, like teaching him being kind to peers. He'll start getting positive peer attention just from doing that. And that in and of itself will be reinforcing for him. And he won't necessarily need like the iPad time to get that peer attention as well. And a lot of times kids that are engaging in this disruptive behavior, when they start to engage in the more pro-social behaviors, they actually start to get more adult attention and more peer attention and more breaks from tasks naturally. And that's reinforcing enough for them after an amount of time of learning the behavior. So I would say these behavior plans are always meant to be temporary. Like whenever you create one of these, the goal is not for it to be permanent, and it can be scaled back. But when you first start it, you want them earning that reward very frequently so they learn the behavior quickly, and then you want to scale it back.
And thank you. There's another question. I'll read it. That came in the chat box. It says, when it's from Christy, when having a child who does well with an edible reward versus a tangible reward, how do you incorporate this into a classroom setting around their peers without passing out the reward to the entire class?
Yeah, for sure. So that can be tricky. 100%. Like if you have there's always those kids in the classroom. They're like, "Why does he have candy? I want candy too." And just like, "Oh man, like no, please don't do this." I would say a lot of times it comes down to like allowing him to have that candy discreetly as like one of the small things of like maybe it's something where you need to create the behavior plan in a way where the other kids aren't realizing that student's being rewarded if they really like that edible reward rather than a tangible reward. And you can come up with something of like so the student knows if you go over the behavior plan with them of like, hey, when you get 5 tallies, you're going to earn your piece of candy, but I'm not going to be able to give you that piece of candy until you leave a little, like I'm going to hold you after specials for a few minutes and then you're going to get that piece of candy then. So like creating a system where they know they're earning things so it's rewarding for them, but then figuring out with that student how to distribute that reward at a time where it's not going to throw off your entire classroom. I will say there are a lot of situations where sometimes I will assume that other kids will get mad or freaked out by it. But a lot of times, like at least in the schools that I'm at, other kids don't even notice. Like a lot of these kids have behavior plans or have had them in the past. And a lot of times, like kids won't get crazy upset if I'm like giving another kid a piece of candy, especially if I've created my classroom expectations away where like they listen to redirection or staying on task in certain situations. Like give a kid a piece of candy and another kid like starts talking over everybody. He's like, why did I like, hey, remember our classroom expectations are X, Y, and Z, and you praise a couple other students, a lot of times you can redirect that student back to being on task and not throwing off the entire environment. So I'd say gauge the class that you're in, understand whether or not you think you can handle if that will work. And if not, figuring out that distribution system of candy or of an edible reward that's not gonna really throw the other kids off task. Sorry if you guys can hear that intercom right now. I'm in a school, so I'm gonna mute my mic until I can hear that question.
That's awesome. I love that you're at a school doing this presentation. So.
Yeah, it was really weird. Someone's gonna come grab me in the middle of this and tell me there was an emergency with a kid. So we made it through without that happening.
Yeah.
Does
anybody else have any questions? Because we have Nick here. I'm sure, Nick, first off, like I think we all want your cell phone number so we could call you at 4 o'clock when we're having behavioral issues in our program, but because this was really good information. So this is the time to ask questions. We will get this PowerPoint and email it out to you, to everyone who's registered on this event. But unmute yourself, feel free to unmute yourself or type your question in the chat box. Yes, we can make the recording available too. That will be posted on the MASN, the Missouri After School Network's YouTube channel. I will have Lena help me with that since she is our techie person. So give us a couple business days to get that up there.
I have a question. In all my years of teaching Sunday school, 4-H and everything, I only had one kid one time, and I don't care what you did with the kid. He was quite destructive. And I mean, we did redirecting, we did everything, but every time you had him, he had to tear something up. And I'm just asking the question because I'm almost retired, but just for somebody else, you know, to learn from it.
So I had a speaker interrupt me right in the middle of that question. You said that you had a student once that regardless of what you were doing would tear or destroy something, and you're curious like maybe what could be done in that situation?
Yeah, just curious, you know, what could we have done different? I mean, he would, you know, you give him crayons, he would tear the break the crayons up, break the box up they were in, just anything he could do to destroy something, he would do it. And, you know.
Yeah, no, that can be tough. I would say a couple of things. Like the first thought that comes to my mind is really thinking about what's he getting when he destroys this thing? And is it the tangible sensation of breaking that? Or when he's destroying that thing, is he getting removed from the classroom and getting a break? Or is he getting attention from his peers for doing that thing? I'd really be asking myself, what's the function of that behavior? And then a couple places I would go with that. If we determined a function, I would try to do that teaching or replacement behavior to see if I can get that behavior to stop. But if that behavior didn't stop, I would start asking myself the question of like, is there something sensory going on here where he like the actual act of tearing something up is bringing him some sort of relief or benefit? Or is there something going on here that's going to require more than just a behavior plan in the classroom? Because there are some kids, and like that will not respond to behavior plans because the after school program or the school itself doesn't have the resources to adequately support that kid. And that could be something like I've seen in classrooms before, whereas if a kid escalates from doing nothing to like threatening to hurt other kids with an object and actually hurting other kids with an object, the best setting for that kid might not be in the classroom for a short time while we get them to a place that they need to be, or they might need outside help from a professional for a variety of reasons. So I would say with that kid, if it was me, I first would have gone after a function-based plan of why do I think he's tearing up this stuff and what's he getting from that, and taught him a replacement behavior. But if that didn't work, maybe see what community resources were available to also help that student with what he was going through.
Yeah, we just never did figure it out. And it's been quite a few years ago. But we just kind of had to really watch what we gave him every week. This was a Sunday school situation. Every week he got the same pencil box that had the same tore up stuff. And
yeah, there's
he would just, and his parents really didn't know what to do with him either. And
yeah, it's a tricky one. Yeah, there's some, I wish I had more time to ask you a lot more in-depth questions and talk about that case, because I love behavior cases. But yeah, that sounds like there's a lot going on there.
Well, I just want to read a couple comments that Nick to you. It said this was very informational and helpful. Thank you. Great presentation. You're a great presenter. I think we all agree that you're a great presenter. So you know your material. And somebody else said they had gotten a lot out of this, and thank you. So, and they appreciate the presentation, great examples and solution.
No, thank you. I really appreciate the kind words, everybody. And one thing I will say is if you start trying this stuff, sometimes you get the function of behavior and you got it wrong and the plan's not working because the function's wrong. Sometimes you're trying to teach a replacement behavior, but the reward that we've come up isn't motivating enough. Sometimes you try to teach a replacement behavior, but the kid wasn't paying attention when we try to teach them the behavior. So I would say, as you do these things, my last word of encouragement would be don't give up when they don't work the first time. Ask yourself, what can I change about this? Usually the first thing that I change is like if it's 5 tally marks, I usually change it to 3 tally marks. The first thing is maybe this reward isn't motivating enough. The next thing I usually change is I look at the function of the behavior. But just one last encouragement to you all, getting good at this stuff takes time. It's okay if the first couple don't work. I would just encourage you to keep at it. I think y'all are going to be wonderful at it. I appreciate the kind words. It was really nice sharing all this with you today.
Well, thank you. If there's no more questions, we will let Nick go since he's out of school and he's probably going to need page or there's something going on announcement. Yeah. So thank you, Nick, so much. I will, Lena and I will reach out to you, just a follow-up email in the next day or two. And we really appreciate your time and your knowledge. And we look forward to having you maybe in the future speak with us again.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for the time. Have a good one, y'all.
Thank you. And I'm going to stop the recording and we are done. So everyone go log out and thank you today.